Hi everyone, this is Bailey Arrendale,
And Sarah Hahnemann.
and we are presenting on Chapter 3, Ethical Behavior, Philosopher's Contributions. The Encyclopedia of Philosophy defines ethics and moral codes as a general pattern or way of life which derives from Buddhist or Christian ethics, a set of rules of conduct or moral code which relates to professional ethics and unethical behavior, an inquiry of ways of life and rules of conduct. This relates to a branch of philosophy called metaethics. The encyclopedia also defines morality as beliefs about nature of man, beliefs about ideals, rules laying down what ought to be done or not, and motives that incline us to choose between the right or wrong course. Each of these is explored using four major ethical theories, none of which are complete yet. The theories are utilitarianism, deontology, justice and fairness, and virtue ethics, which we will discuss in detail later. Ethical dilemmas normally arise when there is not an entirely right option, and an individual must choose between two compelling alternatives. An individual must justify their stance once they make a decision. Sometimes as individuals we don't know or we don't do what we know is right. For example, eating chocolate on a diet. In business, there are many constraints that influence whether a decision maker does the right thing. These constraints are broadly organized into organizational constraints and personal characteristics. Organizational constraints include reward systems, organizational culture, and tone at the top. If a reward system rewards ethical behavior, employees are more likely to be more ethical. And if the company culture or management conducts unethical business, employees will follow suit. Personal characteristics include misguided understanding of business, such as believing a business only operates to make a profit, or overcommitment to the firm, which can cloud ethical judgment, and ethical immaturity. This maturity would come with age and experience and usually doesn't surface until one is actually faced with an ethical dilemma. An example of overcommitment is when John DeLorean, founder of a motor company, attempted to illegally sell cocaine to stall the bankruptcy of his company. Resolving the ethical problems requires careful and thoughtful analysis. A decision maker must then decide whether or not they are going to take action. This is Archie Carroll, who says that you can talk meaningfully about business ethics only if the business is economically viable. If it's not viable, it will go out of business, and then talking about the ethics would be a moot point. He says the goals of business are to remain in business, make a profit, and be ethically and socially responsible. Some argue that an entity's only responsibilities are to be economically viable and to follow the law. So why do individuals choose to be ethical? Some do it for religious reasons because their religion says to act ethically. Others do it in regard for others, as they believe that ethics represents our sympathetic identification with others and is manifested in acts of beneficence, friendship, and love. Others believe we behave ethically because of enlightened self-interest. There is a difference between self-interest and selfishness, as self-interest is an interest concerning the self, not an interest in the self, and selfishness concerns only the individual who places their need above others. In the 1987 movie of Wall Street, Gordon Gekko argues that business is grounded on and motivated by greed. His exact words were that greed, for lack of a better word, is good. The text argues that a better word would be self-interest, as this is what really moves the economy. Unbalanced greed can lead to vulnerabilities and has proved to be risky for individuals and corporations. Self-interest has a long tradition among English empirical philosophy to explain social harmony and economic cooperation. Thomas Hobbes, pictured here, believed that self-interest motivates people to form peaceful civic societies. He also thinks that people are driven by short-term goals, and because of this, civil society is viewed as a voluntary contract, as some people might have to give up their individual freedoms in exchange for peace and self-preservation. Adam Smith, pictured here, believed that self-interest leads to economic cooperation. Buyers and sellers in a market are both interested in satisfying their individual needs and desires, whereas the buyer wants to derive the most satisfaction from the product that they buy, and the seller wants to sell it for the correct price. In a perfect market, the buyer and seller will negotiate to the natural price, and healthy competition will lead to this natural price. Adam Smith believed that profits are made when goods and services are provided effectively and efficiently. In a pin factory example in the book, it explains that if 10 men are working independently, they will only produce a small amount of pins per day, but if they divide the labor of each pin, their productivity will increase tenfold. The book also mentions the concept of the invisible hand of the marketplace, which means that it is impossible to improve one's condition without worsening another's. Smith's economic model states that business is a cooperative social activity, and markets are competitive, not adversarial. Trade is dependent on fair play and honoring contracts, and healthy competition is good. Individuals will follow ethical guidelines for the good of society and thus for the good of the economy. The goal is not just to make a profit. The goal is to provide goods and services in an efficient and effective manner to promote the economic well-being of all and the nation as a whole. Schwartz and Carroll argue that business, ethics, and law can be seen in this Venn diagram. Section 1 says that ethics that it's purely economic, like financial statements. Section 2 contains laws that are purely legal, like driving on the right side of the road. Section 3 contains ethical concerns that are not illegal, like cheating on a spouse. Section 4 contains the rules and regulations that a firm must follow. And Section 6 are the laws and ethics, like the law that murder is illegal. Section 5 is the focus of this text, and some argue that Section 4 is enough, but that would imply that laws and ethics are the same, which is not the case. Section 7 becomes an issue when laws and ethics say different things, and organizations do not know which one to follow. There are many major ethical theories useful in resolving ethical dilemmas. These are the 4 theories that we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. Teleology contains utilitarianism and consequentialism. Telos is Greek for ends, consequences, and results, and it resonates with business-oriented people because it focuses on the impact of decision-making. Investments are judged on expected return, and so philosophers thought that ethical decision-making is similar, and will the result be positive or negative? Utilitarianism is teleological, and it defines good and evil in the terms of pleasure and pain. This pleasure and pain can be mental and physical, or qualitative or quantitative. Hedonism believes that the individual is seeking the highest level of personal pleasure and happiness. Pains are only accepted when they lead to greater pleasures, and pleasures are rejected if they lead to greater pains. On the contrary, utilitarianism measures pain and pleasure at the societal level, and decisions concern all individuals affected by it. For example, if a CEO goes to a board of directors and demands a $100,000 bonus, he's obviously going to be very happy about it, but if he hasn't understood how that will affect all of the other employees, then he is ignoring his ethical responsibility. The key aspects of utilitarianism are that ethicality is assessed on the basis of consequences, and decisions should be oriented towards increasing happiness and reducing pain. Happiness and pain relate to all of society, not just the decision maker, and the decision maker must be impartial. They can't place any extra weight on their personal feelings when making a decision. Act and rule utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism is also called consequentialism, and it explains that action is good if it will produce a greater balance of good over evil, and the action is bad if it will produce the opposite. The presumption here is that it's possible to calculate the net pleasure or pain of a certain decision, and that one should choose the more positive balance when they are netted together. Rule utilitarianism follows the rule that will produce greater balance of good over evil and avoid the rule that will produce the reverse. Human decision-making is guided by rules, and most humans believe that truth leads to the best results. For example, financial statements, if they are just and true, that will lead to the best results for investors and all users of those financial statements. So utilitarianism does not imply that ends justify the means. That's not an economic theory. For example, if two executives collude to falsify financial statements, their means may be the same, or their ends may be the same, but their means of doing so might be different, as one might do it ethically and take out a loan where another might falsify the financial statements. And there is more than one means to achieve an end. For example, cross-country travel, there's many different ways to get there, but they all cost a different amount. And not all means are equal, as there are various ways of stalling a bankruptcy, for example. In utilitarianism, the ends never justify the means. Some of the weaknesses in utilitarianism are that it assumes that things such as pain and pleasure can be quantified. There is no common unit of measure as there is of currency, for example. The distribution and intensity of happiness. Utilitarianism principles believes in producing as much happiness as possible to as many people as possible. For example, if a CEO increases wages by 0.05% across the board, or they double salaries of top management team, the net happiness may be the same, but which decision is more ethical? Obviously, doubling the salaries of the top management team wouldn't provide as much happiness to as many people as increasing the wages by 0.05% across the board would.
Deontology portrays that ethicality of behavior is based on the motivation of the decision maker. Deontologists believe that an action can be ethically correct even if it does not produce a good outcome for the decision maker or society. One deontologist in particular, Immanuel Kant, argued that all of our moral concepts are derived from reason rather than experience. Kant is pictured to the right. He expels that duty is the standard by which ethical behavior is judged, and that moral worth exists only when a person acts from a sense of duty. Also, you are acting correctly when you follow your ethical duties and obligations, not because they might lead to good consequences, but instead for duty's sake. Kant also developed two laws for assessing ethicality. Categorical imperative is the supreme law of morality. It states that you should only act in a way that you would expect someone else who is in a similar situation as you to act. Practical imperative says to act in a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. English philosopher David Hume argued that the need for justice occurs for two reasons. People are not always beneficent, and there are scarce resources. Since we are not self-sufficient in society, we need to cooperate with one another in order to survive. However, since people can benefit at the expense of others, and there are limited resources in society, justice is the mechanism that we need to utilize to fairly allocate the benefits and the burdens of society. Justice presupposes that people have legitimate claims on resources and that they can justify their claims. Ultimately, the meaning of justice is to render or allocate benefits and burdens based on rational decisions made from these claims. There are also two aspects to justice: procedural justice, which is the process for determining the allocation, and distributive justice, which is the actual allocations. Procedural justice concerns how justice is administered. The chapter lists out contributing components of a just legal system, which I have included below. It states that procedures should be fair and transparent, and that no preference should be given based on physical characteristics such as gender, height, hair color, or skin color. There should also be consistent application of the law within the legal jurisdiction and over time. Further, justice should be assessed based on the facts of the case, meaning that the information used needs to be relevant, reliable, and validly obtained. In terms of application of procedural justice in the business world, organizations have set procedures that employees abide by. Because they are standards, whether they are right or wrong, they are usually consistently applied throughout the firm. Employees also have a right to appeal these policies and establish new procedures. Aristotle argued that equals should be treated equally and that unequals should be treated unequally in proportion to their relevant differences. He said, This then is what the just is, the proportional. The unjust is what violates the proportion, meaning that the presumption then is that everyone is equal. In order for distribution of resources to occur, there must be proof that one person is unequal to another based on the relevant criteria. The three main criteria for determining distribution are based on need, arithmetic equality, and merit. Taxation systems are an example of a process that may be need-based. The rich are taxed so that funds can be distributed to the less fortunate in society. An example of arithmetic equality would be when someone is cutting and distributing cake. Assumingly, everyone wants a large piece of cake, so the person cutting would try to cut all pieces equally in order to please everyone. Merit-based means that if one individual contributed more to a project, that individual should receive a greater proportion of benefits from the project. People did have an issue with distributive justice. The issue was that allocations may not be fair. John Rawls developed a theory of justice as fairness in response to this dilemma. He argues that when people are in a state where they are unaware of their place in society, their primary goods, or their natural goods, they should all agree on two principles. The first is that there should be equality in the assignment of basic rights and duties, and that the social and economic inequalities should be of benefit to the least advantaged members of society, which is known as the difference principle. The second principle is the fair equality of opportunity, which states that access to these inequalities should be open to all. Virtue ethics focuses on the moral character of the decision maker. It takes a more holistic approach to understanding human ethical behavior than utilitarianism and deontology does. Virtue ethics recognizes that we are many aspects to our personality, and that each person has a variety of character traits as we develop emotionally. This belief is that although we may have similar virtues, we display them in varying ways. For example, in the corporate world, executives may believe that they wear two hats, one representing personal values and one representing corporate values. Virtue ethics dispels this belief and says that executives can only wear one hat at a time, as there is only one head underneath it. In conclusion, business students are trained to become managers. Managers should be creative problem solvers and use their moral imagination to determine win-win ethical alternatives. The ultimate outcome would be reaching a decision that is good for the individual, the firm, and the society as a whole.